Thank you very much, John. Kia ora koutou katoa. What John didn't mention after the fact that I was one of his star pupils about 35 years ago is that I never looked at tax law again. Not his fault. Now, I've been asked to talk about treaty settlements, not the process, but I'm going to give an overview of treaty settlements, and I've been given somewhere a little bit over 15 minutes to go through 20 plus years of treaty settlement history, so I'm going to go at a fair old canter through that, which will suit me very well because not very much will sink in and you won't be able to ask me any difficult questions at the end of it. But I do want to leave some time for questions, so I am going to go through at, I hope, a decent rate of knots, and to that end I'm going to take my watch off so I keep an eye on the time. So a couple of caveats first. I am a public servant, so I don't speak freely in many places, and I'm not going to speak freely here. I'm not going to be making policy or anything like that, or indeed advocating very much about policy. But I am going to try and inject a few personal observations, despite the fact that this thing is staring me in the face, recording every word. But everything I say, of course, is me speaking and not the government speaking. The second caveat is that I've only been doing this work for about a year and a half now, so I don't have a huge background in it. I know very well about my area of the treaty settlement process, but I don't know, for example, much about the treaty settlement process as it's unfolded in Wellington. I'm sure there are people in this room who know more about that than me. But I will say, even though I haven't had a lot of experience in the year and a half, this process and being involved in this work has changed me quite profoundly. Before I took up the job, I didn't really know much about the treaty settlement process, didn't really have a feel for it, and I'm a boy from Wellington, from Lower Hutt actually, who had a stellar education at Victoria University and then went overseas for a large chunk of my life, and I simply didn't know much about Crown Maori relations, bicultural relations in this country. It was just not something which I'd ever had to think about very much, and that's possibly an indictment on our education system or an indictment on our culture or an indictment on the Foreign Ministry. I'm not sure, it's just the way it was. But in the last year and a half, I've learned a huge amount. My eyes have been opened to some of the realities of our society. I've learned a lot about our history and I've learned a bit about our culture as well. Now, I've been focused in the north. Ngāpuhi is my particular area of responsibility. It's one of the most underprivileged parts of the country, and I see every time I go up there, and it's 37 trips I've made so far, the reality of life in the north for Māori groups. It's been hugely unsettling for me and very informative. Okay, so at a canter, this is where we're up to. Oh, no, that's not where we're up to. We've been doing this process of treaty settlements for about 20 years now. It was Waikato Tainui and Ngāi Tahu who signed the first settlements in about 1995. Since then, another 74 deeds of settlement. This is as of this month. Covered approximately 75% of New Zealand. If you think New Zealand has shrunk somewhat there, we're missing all of the South Island because the South Island has been settled. There are no little green bits on that. So we're focused in the North Island, and I shouldn't forget the Chatham Islands, and you'll see the blue areas are where settlements have been signed, and green generally represents where we are working on the negotiations at the moment. So, as it says, more than half the number, it's probably closer to 60% of Maori groups have been settled at this point. And you'll know, or perhaps you don't know, but government policy is to complete treaty settlement negotiations by 2017. If I weren't a public servant, I'd say yes, but they've been saying that every 3 years for quite a long time now. So all I can say is that that's the policy, and we'll see where we get to. But the rate of progress is good. We've achieved 25 settlements in the past 3 years. I'm going to give you a headline figure now because it's what people often think about, and it's what I'm going to come back to a little bit later on, and that's that we've spent around about $1.9 billion on settlements over that 20-year period. Why are we doing it? Well, this is one of the reasons why we're doing it. This is a couple of weeks ago. These are the 250, or most of the 250 people from Te Hiku, which are the iwi in the far north, Cape Reinga, and down 90 Mile Beach and into the area around Kaitaia, who turned up for the reading of the third reading of their settlement bills in Parliament. Predominantly old people, although a couple of classes of school kids were bussed down as well. And for me, I'd like to claim credit for some of this, but I can't, because this work actually began under people like Matt Rata and Sir Graham Latimer back in the 1980s. It is a long, arduous process to get to settlement, and these people would be just the remnants of the people who began the process all that time ago. But to be there, to be able to participate in it, the sense of celebration and achievement was something which for me was quite profound. So I'm going to race through the objectives, the principles and policies of the Crown when we look at settlement negotiations. I've highlighted in red the ones I just want to focus on, and the other ones I'm not saying they're not important, but these are the ones I want to put some emphasis on. You've heard it said, these are final settlements. The only way you get to a final settlement is if you do make them full settlements and you make them fair settlements. You're not going to achieve the finality that you seek if somehow you don't do these properly. And that's why it can take such a very long time to do it. We're settling all the historical claims. Now that means the ones determined by legislation before 1992. Notionally it's the ones after 6 February 1840, but in fact we look at some issues which arose before 1840 and settle those as well. So we're not dealing with what we call the contemporary claims, which are things like you hear about the water claim. In years gone by we've had reference to the radio spectrum and things like that. We're just dealing with the historical claims. And what's the goal of this? The goal is, very importantly, to say, hey, here is the new basis for the relationship between the Crown and this Māori group that we're settling with. It's about a partnership going forward in recognition of what the courts have said in New Zealand about the treaty being all about a partnership between Māori and the Crown. So we are saying that our job is to re-establish that basis for partnership, to right the wrongs as best we can. And the other thing we focus on very importantly is trying to recognise the rangatiratanga of the group that we're dealing with, which has suffered so much in many cases over such a long period of time, and say, we are providing you a basis to exercise your rangatiratanga over your land and providing you an economic basis so that you can take control of your destiny and not being dependent on the Crown, as has been the case. Just quickly over these ones, fairness between settlements. When you've negotiated something over 60 settlements over now a period of 20 years, you can easily think that you might begin to fall into patterns where you don't follow the precedents that have been set, or you apply different rules to the new groups who come along, and suddenly you find you're in a situation where what you think is fair today was not regarded as fair in the past, and you've got an imbalance. So we very much look to what we've done in the past and try and ensure that there is fairness between the settlements. Ratified by the claimant community. I emphasise that because this is not just about us sitting down with a bunch of self-appointed leaders of a particular iwi and saying, well, let's come to a deal which involves payment of a lot of money and recognition of a few things, and if that's all right with you, then we'll just be able to move on. It's not like that at all. It has to be endorsed by all the members of the claimant group, which can number into the many tens of thousands of people. We never get an absolute consensus on it, of course, but we have to come up with something which is credible in the eyes of the great majority of the people. So there's no quick and dirty about this at all. And then finally on these objectives, policies and principles. Some people feel a bit afraid about the process in the wider community because they think things will be given away to Māori groups, access to certain things or ownership of certain things, and that's going to be at a cost to the wider community. So it is simply a matter of Crown policy that we're not looking at privately owned land. We're not seeking to deprive any groups of access to anything. It is about establishing something which is going to be respected by the wider community as well. And right at the moment, the Te Hiku process that I just referred to, 90 Mile Beach, maybe down here we don't hear about it very much, but controversy over whether or not access by the tour buses to 90 Mile Beach is going to be continued and so on. So these issues arise all the time. Okay. When we talk about settlement, what are we talking about? I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail if time permits. First, and in many ways the most important thing for the group that you're settling with, it's the recognition of the wrongs that have been committed. And that means that we sit down and we work through their grievances in detail, and we construct together an apology which will reflect their feeling of grievance and provide, in their view, an appropriate acknowledgement of what has been done wrong over the past 175 years. The cultural redress is about trying to return where we can sites of cultural significance to groups. These might be urupā or cemeteries or other sites of significance. Relationships, trying to put in place relationships between the group and the Crown which will be enduring and which will reflect the importance of the group in terms of the importance of the relationship with the Crown. Natural resources co-governance is very important. It's where we think about what we might regard as public assets like harbours, for example, and say, yes, but there's a Māori interest in that, and how do we properly give recognition to that? So it's working out the balance of interests there and reflecting that in the settlement process. Financial and commercial, and I mentioned the figure of 1.9 billion before because it's often what, sadly, catches the headline. This group got $90 million in quantum through a treaty settlement process. Those media headlines seldom refer to the grievances which have taken place, which have existed for such a long period of time, which are being redressed through the settlement process. It doesn't talk about all the other aspects of settlement as well. It just focuses on that headline figure because that's easy for, I suppose, for the media to do, and some of the figures are quite large. We look at the Crown assets that we have, Crown property, which is available to be transferred back, and we focus to the extent we can on the big assets like Crown-owned forests, for example. And we also bring into that schools and jails and police stations. PSGE is a reference to the post-settlement governance entity, which is to say that the group has to establish a body which is accountable and transparent, and which we can have confidence that as we transfer the money and the assets to that group, it's going to do a decent job. And you know, without me having to remind you, that some groups in the past have not done great jobs with their settlement proceeds. There's been a lot of wastage, loss along the way, and that's something that we are determined to the extent possible to avoid. But hey, this is a process where we are handing back to a Māori group the ability to carve its own destiny, and that means that the Crown steps right back. So we do the best we can to set up the right kind of group with them at the outset. What they do after that is up to them. All right, so in the interest of time, I am really going to flick very quickly through these ones because I've talked about them already. Let me just say about the Crown apology. The groups that we deal with, invariably you go into a place, onto a marae, and it tends to be older people that you're dealing with. And they feel their history in a most profound way. They feel their grievance in a way which is difficult for me as a person of European descendants to feel. I know that when I talk to them, I'm talking to people who have lived that grievance not only all their lives, but their parents' lives, their grandparents' lives, their great-grandparents' lives, perhaps their great-great-grandparents' lives. These are profound emotions. And in some cases you feel that it is the most important thing about the way some people identify. It's about their grievance against the Crown. And what we're asking people to do is to let that go, to make a decision to move on in the interest of forming the new relationship with the Crown, not to hold on to the grievance, not to forget the past, but to look towards the future. That's a very challenging ask, and can't be underestimated. And that's why it is so hard often enough to get to this negotiating table. What we're asking them to do is to be prepared to make the call to let that grievance go in the interests of reaching a settlement that they are going to feel they can pass on to their children, and that their children are not going to hold it against them, or their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. So it is an intergenerational challenge, and we can't underestimate how difficult it is. So yes, I think I've just about used my time, so I'm going to flick over these other two and just talk for 1 minute about my particular area, which is Ngāpuhi in the north. This map, which doesn't come out very clearly, but it shows the area from Whangarei Harbour in the bottom right up to the Hokianga on the left and across to the Whangaroa Harbour on the top right. And all this is doing is showing the really quite considerable bits and pieces of Crown land that we are looking at in terms of the settlement process. So all those little black things are actually numbers referring to a site, and some of those are utterly insignificant. They might just be a little piece of road reserve. Others of them will denote schools or parks or conservation land or police stations, and the green areas are areas of Crown forest. So this is the amount of the Crown property asset, if you like, that you've got to pass over or talk about in the settlement process. Ngāpuhi, it's the biggest iwi in the country, and it is a bit unique in terms of the challenge it provides. It's got about 130,000 people, of whom about 25 or 30,000 still live in the Rohe in the north, which means there's a vast population in Auckland and Wellington and Sydney. It's also a little bit distinct from many Māori groups in that it doesn't have a tradition of an ariki or a supreme leader. It is famously a group where each of the hapu says they never conceded leadership to any particular line of descent or to any particular hapu. So that means that if we have 110 hapu in Ngāpuhi, which is far more than any other iwi in the country has, we have to somehow corral them or make them wish to be corralled into a treaty settlement process where they can talk to us in the context of a single negotiation. Let me tell you, that is so close to being impossible, I don't want to think about it. But okay, I don't have a good closing line for this. It's been a 20-year journey of settlement so far. Bear in mind that this month is the month that the Dame Whina Cooper-led Māori Land March arrived in Wellington 40 years ago. I think we've come a long way. We're well over halfway through this particular settlement journey. I've got this job for another couple of years, and whether I'll finish off Ngāpuhi, I don't know. We have a way to go, but that's my job. It's my only job, and I'm enjoying it tremendously. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Perhaps we've got time for one burning question.
Yeah, thanks. The other side of the treaty settlement process is what happens afterwards. So I work in the Office of Treaty Settlements, and it's a sunset industry. It's just as well I'm almost old enough to be thinking about retirement. The plan is that as the work of the Office of Treaty Settlement phases down, the work of a group which is inelegantly named the Post-Settlement Commitments Unit will wind up. And that's only got 5 or 6 or 7 staff at the moment, and it's got a massive workload. Just in terms of the 60 settlements that have been done to date, we know that there are somewhere around about 7,000 individual commitments which have been entered into. So just keeping track of those and making sure that departments are aware of them is a massive undertaking. And that's just going to increase significantly over time. So over time, Office of Treaty Settlements will wind down and perhaps disappear, and Post-Settlement Commitments Unit, hopefully with a better name, will pick up. I see that one day there's going to have to be an accounting for or recognition of the need to have a proper management of the Crown-Maori relationship in the post-settlement world. Perhaps the home for that is the Ministry of Justice, perhaps it's somewhere else, I don't know.